Hi, I'm Gerald Major, and cannabis saved my life. Continues to do so. So, if I can do it, so can you. Welcome to Expedition Wellness. I have with me a longtime friend of mine, a researcher, a pharmacist, a patient advocate, and a patient yourself. Sandra Couto, please introduce yourself.
Thanks so much for having me, Gerald. Really excited to be here. Yes, I am a patient advocate for medical cannabis. I'm a patient myself. I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis about 8 years ago, and medical cannabis has become part of my daily drug regimens and has saved my life. I'm also a licensed pharmacist, have been practicing for 25 years. My passion is really to help patients and consumers better understand the medications they're taking and how to take them so that they have the most impact and best outcomes. And I don't know if I would consider myself a researcher, more of a wannabe researcher, but I have had the privilege of working over the last 10 years or so with big data for large research organizations and institutions, and appreciate the value in collecting and documenting outcomes so that we can learn more about the medications we're taking and how they impact our daily lives.
Excellent. So, you're on the show here really to validate me. Um,
Well, I don't know to validate you, but
well,
definitely to share my personal and professional experience with medical cannabis to date.
Right. So we met in arthritis.
We did.
For those of you that don't know my story, I suffer from ankylosing spondylitis and psoriatic arthritis. I have been since 14 years old. And what happened next is actually quite shocking. I was left alone, really, at 14 years old through the next 32 years of my life. Here I've finally found some sense of stability. I happen to believe that mind, body, knowledge, and support are the
Mm-hmm.
four things that really will make a difference. And the purpose of Expedition Wellness is for me to share my journey and bring in people that can also validate what I'm doing so that others can kind of find their way through me. Um,
And I think that's remarkable for you to open up your personal experience, professional experience as well, and make it available to patients. I think that's what we need more of, not only for patients but for the healthcare providers and the medical community to be able to create that kind of a forum where people can express themselves and come forward in terms of sharing their experiences with medical cannabis.
So in my case, let me just run you through some of the things that I found over the years for me, and specifically, we did an event on Family Day,
I remember, yeah, it
and
was a great
so you
event.
were participating, and so I mean, it's not necessarily about the actual things that I brought in, but it was my way of bypassing all the questions around research to
Mm-hmm.
actually prove that what I've done is actually working.
Mm.
So what we did is we brought in, and we'll talk about kind of the mind, body, knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and support, and we'll kind of break that down because what we're trying to do here is bring a lot of knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and at times when disease is lonely, support. And then if we can show some tools around the mind and the body and how to get things well, I think together as a community we can succeed. So
Absolutely.
one of the first and most important things for me was that started last year was Krav Maga. I know
Mm.
you participated in that. So a lot of
Yeah.
activity, and people would think that that's all physical. But what I found in participating in it for now over a year is that while you're doing the physical, your mind's always going.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of times where I would go to do exercise in the gym and I'd have a really hard time motivating myself. So let's kind of break down the physical and the mental
Mm-hmm.
and what you witnessed in Krav Maga, and let's explain why that's so important to patients.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of things. I mean, people don't appreciate the impact that medical cannabis has on your well being and how it can actually, for some people, it can actually slow their mind and help them focus more on the day to day activities. So, for that particular activity, we really needed to be focused, right?
Right.
It called to that. And so, in that case, I think that there there's definitely an augmentation, if you will, of I don't know where this is going.
That's
Sorry.
fine, but from an arthritis perspective, I mean, we've talked about many times exercise being the most important
Right.
form of medication.
Right. Absolutely.
And so, what happens in the body with that? What happens to the medications that you use when your circulation is flowing?
Right. And I think that's a really important thing, because a lot of patients that struggle with arthritis take a lot of medications as well. I know myself, early on in my disease, I was in a lot of pain. So we tend to use anti-inflammatories, opioids. And so one of the things that researchers have found now is that when patients are using medical cannabis, THC itself can actually augment the effectiveness of opioids, for example. And so patients don't need to take as much of those medications, which leaves them very groggy, which leaves them cloudy and unable to focus. So I think that there is definitely a place and value that medical cannabis plays in terms of reducing other medications that arthritis patients, for example, will take. Now, that's not to say that medical cannabis is replacing our arthritis drugs. I mean, I still take my medications, but I don't need as much of them. And I certainly don't need my opioids anymore. And very little do I need my anti-inflammatories.
So you just touched on a pretty hot topic these days.
Opioids.
And because I'm here sharing, let's get right into it and talk about my opioid use.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah, so I mean, just as I say that, I've got to take a big gasp of air because I've kind of seen what the opioid crisis has done to me over the last 3 or 4 years. I got up to 700 milligrams of opioids per day. That's a big amount.
That's crazy,
right? So,
and what were some of the effects that you?
Well, I
actually
definitely
experienced?
noticed exactly what you're talking about, and this is the value of being followed by healthcare professionals, right? Because when I was at 700 milligrams a day, I now take just over 60. And that was a 5-year span that I had to actually be controlled and monitored reduction. But what I found within that is when I was using cannabis as well as opioids, it did exactly what you're talking about. I actually blacked out one night, and I haven't blacked out since. So there is certain reactions that people need to pay close attention to. So as a pharmacist,
and your healthcare professional, I was going to ask you, how did you work through that with your healthcare professional, or were you able to? Because one of the things that I really advocate to patients when they come and speak with me about this is really 3 things. You know, you want to be honest and upfront with your healthcare professional. Yeah. You want to be accountable in terms of tracking what you're taking, but you also want to be responsible. And so those are the 3 things that I live by and speak to patients about. But I'm just curious to.
This is a beautiful story. I mean, you know, my rheumatologist. So
I do.
This is actually a very impactful story. It was 5 years ago or so, and it said, "Hey doc, I'm gonna start using medical cannabis." And she said, "Well, I don't know anything about it, so knock yourself out." So right there, 5 years ago, there's absolutely no support, right? This is why we're doing this show, because I've been through it and you don't need to go through this alone.
Right.
So I gave her full, she had constant contact with my prescriber of cannabis. They worked together on the reductions. I then sought after help from a psychiatrist in Toronto General, which then explained to me that although you may not be addicted, your brain becomes dependent. So then when I started to notice that, of course, when you start to look at opioids and getting off opioids, people want to come off really fast.
Right.
And that's dangerous. Very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of when you start to understand the effects of opioids, when you start going through those types of withdrawals, when you're not addicted, but dependent. So we came down, and I think we did about 10% a month. And it took, 5 years in between surgeries. I go for surgeries every year. So, so where I am right now is I'm at a fairly low dose, and I'm going to go through surgery. I'm going to try to go with everyone's help. I'm going to try to go with no increase of opioids. And then shortly after that, I'll try to come off.
That's amazing. That's a great story.
I mean, but that's the way everyone should have access to. I mean, that should be available to everyone.
But remember, you took the first step, right? So you were very forthcoming and honest. One of the one of the three things that I recommend: being honest with your healthcare professional. I think we need to work with our healthcare professionals and the community together. I think that that's the way in which we're going to move medical cannabis forward and bring it back into the circle of care.
Right.
You've often heard me speak about this, and bring it back into our day-to-day drug regimens, so that it can become
It's
a staple.
normalized, right?
It can just be it could be just like your Tylenol, your acetaminophen. The more we work around our physicians and our healthcare professionals, I really feel like we're taking steps backwards. We really need to be bringing it forward, and you'll find that some physicians are very hands off, as to your rheumatologist, but supportive in terms of you finding your care. And then other physicians are slowly getting more comfortable with prescribing and understanding dosing.
But you still have those that are out there that want nothing to do with it, actually discourage its use. And then you have,
Right.
I've heard of grandmothers taking the CBD oil that's prescribed to their pet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and that's an interesting population of patients, or seniors populations. When we look at where medical cannabis is being used more, it's in our senior population,
Right.
not in where people were concerned about in our youth population.
Right.
Now, what's special about that population, though, is that we have to remember that over 50% of patients in general, there was a recent report that was published in 2018 that said that over 50% of patients are taking more than 3 medications
Right.
a day, which means that inevitably they're going to be at risk of developing an adverse event or a drug-drug interaction. Our seniors are compounded because they're taking more,
Right.
but they're the population of patients that can really benefit from medical cannabis. I mean, there's a lot of other populations that we can look at. So absolutely.
So let's move out throughout the day.
Sure.
Krav Maga was the first stop. I think subtle energy was next,
Yep.
and subtle energy. So we just came out of the opioid conversation, and I talked about the impact on my brain.
Mm-hmm.
So we started to look at different ways, because the pain is still there. The
Absolutely.
pain that I have is still there. If I consume cannabis, it can shift my mood, allow me to process it better, but the pain is actually still there. So then the question becomes, what do you do about this lingering pain, right? So I found meditation and some different types of guidance.
Mm-hmm.
Subtle energy allows me to really just kind of relax through breath work and thoughts. Advocacy, as you know, can get lonely.
Mm-hmm.
So can disease. I mean, when I was in the middle of my disease, people were abandoning me. I was isolating myself.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you need to kind of look for signs
Mm-hmm.
to just get you over the hump. So mind work and mind and body, and that together, I mean, that definitely plays a big role.
So, question for you: have you been able to document or sort of observe changes to how you perform in these exercises classes before, like when you're taking your medical cannabis versus when you're not? I think that's really
Right.
very insightful information that as patients and consumers, we really need to start paying attention to.
And that's why I employed those 2 heavy duty machines.
Right.
That shows data, right?
Right.
So for the first time in my life, I was able to see results of my actions right in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
So those machines were really a guide to say there's something here on the research. So
Mm-hmm.
absolutely, I've done experiments on myself, N of 1,
Mm-hmm.
to see, okay, so what is my endurance like? What's my strength like? What's my flexibility like? As you know, with arthritis, a lot of times we're stiff, especially in weather like this.
Absolutely.
And so anything to kind of get you going and get in a bed, it ends up being good. So
Mm-hmm.
movement is great.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why I employed those machines. So talk about, specifically, I was worried about my brain. I've gone through some cognitive decline as a result of my opioid use and chronic disease and inflammation. But I needed to understand that it was still working. So the true agility, I mean, that's really brain speed. How fast can you react to a light?
Right.
So
That was that was very eye-opening for me. That was the first time I'd actually seen it. And, we all have different levels of endocannabinoids in our
Right.
system. So, you and I can both take medical cannabis and have very different experiences. And the reason being is that we have different levels of receptors. Our receptors have different sensitivities to medical cannabis. So our experiences are going to be very different. But where we can actually see the difference is in ourselves, right?
Okay.
So it's not intra, it's inter variations that we have to document. So you will experience very different effects when you're taking medical cannabis and stimulating your brain with the brain agility, for example. And we saw that when you did it versus when there was another person that did it. Their response times varied,
Right.
because they're different. They're different genetic makeup.
Yeah. So, I mean, that whole day for me was really kind of a culmination of what I've been doing over the last 20, 30 years. My background is kinesiology, so I've known this stuff, and then arthritis took me out of sport.
Right. So what inspired you to look at those 3 or 4 different technologies and equipment? Was it something that you had been personally doing that you wanted to bring forward? Was it something that you, like, part of your expedition, your wellness?
Quite honestly, I mean, I can just be some guy that gets up here and says, "Hey, cannabis saved my life." Right, but without the proof. I mean, people, unfortunately, in today's world, people need to see to believe.
Right.
And that's just the quickest way. I really couldn't care if it's a machine or if it's something else. I mean, I know from a result, if I do 20 push-ups one day, I can do 20 push-ups now. I can see the improvement, but putting data, you talked about big data, and from my work in advocacy through, the typical pharmaceutical model, I've had a lot of exposure to research. Then when I look into cannabis, what I hear is, so you'll have real world evidence. You'll have some studies that are done by LPs, specifically the opioid substitution studies. So that was particularly important to me as I was reducing my opioids. So as a patient, I'm sitting through these presentations, and it's actually inspiring me. It's actually trying to keep me going. But then when you get into, the typical research model, I mean, it doesn't quite cut it.
Yeah.
So this is your opportunity to tell me why.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you raise a really good point, and I think that the general public is probably not aware of what really goes on in terms of drug development. The pharmaceutical industry, when you just look at a new molecule that's been discovered, the industry or the company will run clinical trials on it in the event or in the hope of wanting to get it patented, so it comes to market as a drug. The challenge with medical cannabis or cannabis is that, as we all know, it's a plant, and it's a generic plant. It's not been patented. And so very few licensed producers are going to do the clinical trial work that is required, unless they can actually look at formulations that they know for a fact will actually, pan out to be a silver bullet, if you will. And so right now, the focus has been on collecting real world evidence. And what does that mean? That means that not like in your clinical trials where patients are what I would call clean. So they've been stripped away from disease. They're taking very few medications. They're sort of your clean profile. The real world evidence trials are looking at patients like you and I. We have multiple comorbidities. We're taking multiple medications. And so we're looking at the effectiveness of medical cannabis in the real world. And so there's been a lot of really great strides, if you will, in terms of bringing forward a lot of real world evidence data. Now what we need to do is actually take it one step further.
Right.
Now we need to start looking at, okay, so we know that medical cannabis is working in this type of population or this type of patient. What we need to look at is tying it back to the strains, but at a genetic level, because we know that with cannabis, there's a lot of different genetic strains. There's a lot of drift. So this is really exciting for researchers. And I get really excited about this because we live in a world of data, big data. I mean, I'm wearing my Apple Watch, right? We are constantly bombarded and immersed in it. And so we need to do the same diligence with medical cannabis. We really need to do that. And I think as patient advocates, you and I and our viewers, I think that's exactly what we need to be doing, is moving the needle forward.
Right. So how long? How long is that needle going to take? I mean, as we wait, patients are suffering,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're overspending, we're underprescribing. Precision medicine, I I I believe that precision medicine can come to cannabis before it gets to the pharmaceutical industry.
I would agree with you. I think that we're almost there, and I would love to be able to come back on one of
Yes.
your shows and talk a little bit more about some of the projects that I'm currently involved in and the partners that I'm working with to create more standardization for medical cannabis, the quality of our medical cannabis. Patients absolutely need that. Just like when you go to the drugstore and you buy your Tylenol, you know exactly what's in that Tylenol bottle. We need to do the same for medical cannabis.
Especially when we're talking about, you mentioned it earlier about the older demographic. When we start
Absolutely.
to look at patients, I start thinking immediately to my parents, and they're comfortable walking into their pharmacy and getting
Hmm.
their drugs. And quite frankly, my mother would not know if it was a capsule of THC or a capsule of vitamin D.
Right.
So at I mean, we've made some progress in pharma distribution.
We
We've
have.
we've made a little bit of movement in normalizing things. So very, very important to get to standardization. So
Yeah.
you can come in and talk about that all day long.
I'm excited to
The
do that. Yeah. Yeah.
the interesting part about you, and I'll just remind our viewers that you're a healthcare professional, but
Hmm.
you're also a patient.
Absolutely.
So you can see things really that other patients can't see.
Hmm.
I wanted to give you a little bit of time just to talk about the importance of being followed by a healthcare professional. So my cannabis use has changed significantly. I started using cannabis shortly after my disease hit in at 14 years old.
Hmm.
So then what has progressed through the next 32 years or so is that I'm using cannabis much more differently now than I ever have in the past.
Hmm.
Before I started, it was just consuming flower,
Hmm.
inhaling.
Hmm.
And now I've switched to, I use a topical cream. I use oils for just in the same manner that I would use an opioid for a time released opioid. I now use an ingestible oil.
Hmm.
For the same way I would use a breakthrough opioid, I use inhalation.
Hmm.
And then when you go beyond that and you start to look at meals and you start to look at the amount of, when you look at the medical cannabis patient, someone asked me not too long ago, what is a medical cannabis patient? Well, a medical cannabis patient actually is a patient
Right.
that
First and foremost.
chooses to use medical cannabis.
Right.
But unfortunately, in this industry, the patient has had to become the scientist, the researcher, the pharmacist, the baker,
Agreed.
right? So unfortunately, the patient, and kind of fortunately for the patients in our room, because I believe that through force, the cannabis patient is actually one of the most knowledgeable patients on the planet
Hmm. Hmm.
because they've had to do things on their own for so long.
Right. And often the patients that go to see their physicians and ask for medical cannabis patients, I mean, those are the patients that are really wanting to integrate medical cannabis into their daily practice, not to get high, right? These are the patients that really see medical cannabis as a therapy. So I think, you touched a little bit about the importance of the healthcare professional. And as a pharmacist, for me, I really think that pharmacists can play an integral role in all of this. We often see that patients will be referred by their physicians to a medical cannabis clinic. And I think that the clinics can provide a great level of information and education. Unfortunately, a lot of the clinics right now don't have a full overview of patients'
Right.
drug profile. So you've gone in to see a number of clinics, you get your assessment done, they will screen you and assess you for medical cannabis, but they may not know the nuances in terms of how medical cannabis is going to interact with all of your 13 or 14 drugs. The key healthcare professional in all this is the pharmacist. And so being able to bring that conversation back to your pharmacist, whether it's your local pharmacy or even just stopping into one of the retail stores, there has been a lot of education now for pharmacists in terms of getting their certification for medical cannabis. So by 2020, by the end of this year, pharmacists need to complete, those that are licensed in Ontario at least. I know some of the other provinces have started doing that as well. So the pharmacist can play a very important role. And also tweak your other meds in consultation with your physicians. Physicians have a burden of looking at all of the diseases you're taking, but they're not the experts in drugs, right? So I think, and you being able to sort of showcase that you have been very proactive in making your physicians aware of what you're taking. I was going to ask you about your relationship with your pharmacist outside of you and I. How have you leveraged your pharmacist in terms of integrating them into your cannabis journey?
Actually, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know that I really have with my pharmacist, to be honest. It's another medication I take, so the contraindication, they know full well that I use medical cannabis, but I've always, as a patient, I've always kind of left that into the hands of the physician, the prescribing physician, and not necessarily at the counter of the pharmacy. So you're saying something different.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that I can impress that upon you and the other patients that are watching. I think we need to leverage, and as patients, we are very educated and informed, and we need to be able to leverage as many resources as we can. We know physicians are bombarded and burdened. There's a long waiting list. Sometimes you just want to be able to access a healthcare professional that can give you a quick answer. And I think that the pharmacist can play a very important role in all of this in terms of minimizing your drug interactions, your unwanted side effects, and to your point, getting you even off of opioids, right? If you're taking medical cannabis, you can very easily start to taper your dose of opioids as you've done. Proof is in the pudding, right?
Yeah, and so that's gonna. I want to play a little bit of a game here where we're gonna look at. So all of this is fine and dandy, and it's great that this is what's happened. But it's cost me money. Every single reduction I've made from opioids or sleeping pills to cannabis, it's cost me out of pocket money.
Right.
I think I shared something the other day that says my monthly supply of 2 different opioids cost me a copay of $18.87. And in some cases, that's 1 gram of medical cannabis. So let's talk about the impact of research and pharma distribution on cost.
Well, I think it starts with collecting outcomes, right? So in my previous role where I was working with very expensive drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, one of the things was, how do we ensure patients have access to these very novel, very effective, but very expensive drugs? A lot of payers couldn't continue to pay for them, and employers. And I think that we can learn from those models with medical cannabis by documenting and collecting that data so that we can go back to payers and say, when you're taking medical cannabis, you're actually using less of your other drugs. You're actually going to work. You're paying taxes. You're not going to the hospital or seeing doctors. So what is the cost of being on as a medical cannabis patient? What is the cost of your existence, if you will?
And that's where
the impact.
That's where clinical trials can get you.
Well, I think research in general, like real world evidence, is where we're going with this, and being able to look at the impact it has on healthcare utilization. And that's where I think the research is moving forward. Payers are interested in that data. We just, as patients, we need to coalesce and share that data so that we can actually get behind the movement and get medical cannabis on formularies, on drug plans where
so
it
that's
should
our
be.
call out, really, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I'm a big advocate of data. That's what drives me, and I think that patients have to, we have to coalesce together and work towards it. If we want it, then we have to work on it together.
Right. Well, this is the opportunity to do that. So I have you on record saying that we're going to get to the bottom of the research thing together.
Slowly but surely, yes.
All right. So now we're going to get to the elephant in the room.
The cost.
Right? Yeah. So This is great and you can do all this stuff, but if you can't afford it, then what good is it? So let's just break down what we spend on cannabis and how we use it in our daily lives. What do you spend?
So I use oils and flour. I wouldn't recommend flour for any naive patient on medical
Right.
cannabis, certainly with anything smokable or inhalable, but there have been times where I really need it for my pain. Probably on average, I would say $350 a month.
And that's combined on the oils
The
and the
oils.
flour.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So
So
what
three
about
fifty.
you?
I mean, I spend a little bit more than that, but actually, it's really kind of hard for me to track. I basically use what I can afford.
Right.
So there's times, like I said before, I use topicals a lot for my psoriasis, for joint pain and stuff like that. So I mean, I'll do topicals really whenever someone kind of gifts that to me. So that's how I'm treating my skin psoriasis. I mean, there's pharmaceutical creams out there, the corticosteroid
Right.
creams that I can get for free. There hasn't been any advancement in that area for
Nope.
I think 10 years or so. And it said to thin out
So
your skin a bit.
So, as a patient, then, just coming back to working with your healthcare professionals, and you mentioned you weren't necessarily bringing your pharmacist involved. How are you deciding on how to prioritize or create a regimen where when you fall short of money and you can't actually get your medical cannabis full dose? How do you decide on where you're going to get your medical cannabis for your ailment? Does it actually influence the other drugs that you're taking?
Yeah, I mean anything that you would use that's not regulated, I mean that could be doing more harm than good.
So do
The
you
fact
have
of the
to?
matter is patients right now don't have a whole lot of choice in the matter.
Mm-hmm,
Fixed income is fixed income. I left work 10 years ago now, so I
mm-hmm,
haven't had a raise in 10 years.
mm-hmm.
I have the same house, the same expenses, more expenses.
Right,
And so when you're on fixed income, you get certain allotments for certain things.
right,
And that's my bucket. And if I have, generous friends or people that have ointments, mostly the ointments, I can't, I've always cut out my ointments.
right,
I'll go right to, flour or a concentrate or an oil.
right.
But
Right.
that's kind of my go-to when I travel. It ends up being kind of whatever I can find.
Yeah.
That's the life of a
I
patient.
want to talk to you about traveling, but before we get to that, I've had a lot of patients come to me and say, Sandra, I can't afford the medical
Right.
cannabis channel. Like I can't afford, it's too expensive for me. I'm going to try other options and lean on friends or grow my own. And for me, I always come back to this, the one burning question is, how do you know what you're actually taking when it's not from an authorized licensed producer?
I know. Isn't that horrible?
So if we're going to have this conversation and we're going to be honest about it, patients need to access quality medical cannabis. They need to have options. They need to have a sustainable way of accessing it. But we know that they're turning to
Right.
other
Yeah,
sources.
they're turning black market. They're supplementing wherever
Right.
they can. I mean, this is the thing with patients, and even when you talk about research, as a patient, I don't really need to know the research behind when I consume cannabis. I can fall asleep or I get hungry for my appetite. Right. So this is the same for patients. I mean,
Right.
ultimately, they want to get better.
Right. Well, I'm going to challenge you on that. You may know that cannabis actually works for you, but if we want to make it affordable and accessible to the rest of our community
Right.
out there, we need that aggregated data.
Yes.
Because the insurance companies, the payers are asking for this data. And if we believe that cannabis is a true medicine, we need to do our part. Just like they do in big pharma, where they're consolidating clinical trials and testing it in patients. We as patients, we need to put our hands up and participate in those trials. Even though we may know already what the outcomes are, our data points are very important to moving that needle forward, because otherwise we're going to keep working around the elephant in the room, if you will, right?
Right.
So we need to do our part.
So our part means that, our community our patients need to raise their hands, get involved in studies, demand studies.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're gonna keep them accountable here.
Absolutely.
And
our
so,
healthcare professionals need to be doing more as well. I mean, they need to be, well, I shouldn't say they need to be. I'd like to see them provide more support for patients like you and
right.
I, but also take more of an active role in learning and participating in the data collection process. Absolutely.
I'm thinking that the 2.0 on cannabis, though, I mean, that'll help. I know patients. I'm not a chemist, so I don't do my own conversions and extractions, but I know very many patients that they'll do their own little extractions of their flower.
Right.
And they say that for whatever reason, that is what extends extends their value. I know edibles in some manners can be more effective than consuming by smoke, and likely probably everything would be a little bit more effective than smoking.
It's definitely the last option that I would recommend to patients, simply because I'm not a proponent of anything inhaled or smokable. You touched on a good point with edibles. Anything that is orally administered will actually have more of a long lasting effect, but the onset of its action is going to be a little more delayed. So for an immediate flare, we live with chronic pain, something that we need immediately, it wouldn't probably be our go-to. There are new sprays that are coming to market. There are new sublinguals that are coming to market. I'm hearing some of the aerosols, the meter dose inhalers are coming. So I think that the licensed producers are definitely doing their part. The researchers are doing their part. Patients need to do their parts, and healthcare professionals need to do their part.
Excellent. Well, I mean, how about this? I'll make you a deal.
Deal. Okay.
So you're easy. Deal before I tell you the deal. Now I could do anything. I'll make you a deal.
I'll take that back.
I'll make you a deal, an honest deal. I'll go for surgery in March. It's a pretty massive one, both feet. So what I'll try to do is I'm going to adjust my oil intake.
Okay.
And I'm going to relax a bit on my flower, try to stretch the dollar a little bit more, and see if I can go without increase of opioids.
Okay. And document it, please.
I will.
We'll create a little diary for you so we can document it along with all the other medications you're taking.
Excellent. Anything else to share?
No, I mean, I think that I'm really excited to be here and to be part of your journey. I think that we can reach a number of patients, but we also can reach our medical community in working with our healthcare professionals. Your testimony in terms of you starting with your physicians, your call out, people like myself on your show. I think that we need to start to work closer with our community and our healthcare professionals.
Well, it takes a village.
It does.
Unfortunately, such a big village. But I mean, if we can help here on this show to kind of package things for people so that they don't have to go through the journey alone. And oftentimes in chronic illness, patients and families are feeling alone and isolated. There's not a whole lot of tools around. Once you get hit by a physical ailment, the next thing to follow is the mental side of things. Right. So I think the message here on Expedition Wellness is that you're never alone.
Nope.
Not with us. So join Expedition Wellness and let's get well together.
Great.
Thanks a lot,
so
Sandra.
much. Yeah.